I agree. That's a message that they should at least fondle and think about. But actually getting the
I don't think
nomination.
we want the Democrats fondling anything.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics for Monday, March 10th. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm joined by RCP President and co-founder Tom Bevan and Washington Bureau Chief Carl Cannon. Well, gentlemen, this month marks the 5th anniversary of the date when COVID-19 was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. And at least according to one new book, which is entitled In COVID's Wake, How Our Politics Failed Us. It's by two Princeton political scientists. They say Anthony Fauci and his team did a pretty terrible job. So, Tom, there's a lengthy piece on the front page of RCP summarizing the main points of the book, but tell us what you think of it and what you know and whether you think a major rethink of our COVID policy should be in the works.
First, I want to say, Andy, you pointed out the other day when you were at your mother's house, and I'm clearly not at my normal location. I had to decamp, and I am at Wind Forest Partners here in Lake Forest, Illinois. So shout out to the guys here for letting me borrow their space.
And having an axe over your shoulder, that's pretty interesting.
And they have a dress code. You can only wear hoodies.
It's their swag, Carl. That's why I have it on.
Sure, you're fully branded.
That's right. Fully branded. Product placement, Cannon. Yeah, no, listen, this article by David Scharfenberg recounting, he got an advance copy of this book, and you know, the title on it is a little provocative, The Case Against Anthony Fauci. But it is, and he mentions in here, you know, it's a pretty critical look at the entire system and how it failed during COVID because of various things, including the fact that our leaders, our public health leaders, you know, obfuscated, misled, stifled other opinions, you know, threw skepticism out the window and instead replaced that with suppression of voices. And the authors themselves, that Scharfenberg describes them as liberal and left-leaning, and that's why this book is so bracing for a lot of folks, is because this is not some, you know, right-wing analysis. This is done, and again, I hope we are able to get the authors on the show when the book comes out at the end of this month, and I'm looking forward to reading it because I do think we need very critical looks at what happened during COVID and you know, why things failed as badly as they did and what kind of long-term damage was done, and in hopes of avoiding those pitfalls in the future. Again, I've said this before, I have no confidence whatsoever that if we had a pandemic tomorrow, that our institutions would function a whole lot differently. Maybe they would now with Jay Bhattacharya, for example, leading NIH. But certainly when it comes to like folks in the media, I mean, there was a front page story in the New York Times today by the journalist who called the lab leak theory racist, talking sort of scaremongering and saying we're vulnerable to another pandemic because of all the cuts to USAID. I just feel like the media would run the same playbook, and certainly to the extent that that COVID was politicized, we'd see that same sort of thing happen again, unfortunately.
Carl, it is interesting. It is sort of the 5th anniversary of the start of COVID, or I guess what we're really talking about is the day that the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic. That was actually on March 11th. So tomorrow is the actual 5th anniversary of that. But, you know, the United States hasn't really marked it as much as other countries. In the UK, they had a day of mourning over the weekend. But in the US, it's sort of, I think it's sort of passing without as much remark, although we do have this new book that is going to force a reevaluation, I assume.
Well, let's start with this. March 11th was not the 5th anniversary of the pandemic. It was, as you said, the 5th anniversary when the World Health Organization, which had resisted under pressure from China from calling it pandemic, finally realized what everybody else realized. The origin of the virus, it was sometime in the autumn, September, late September, October. China was covering it up, actively covering it up, and then refusing to share data, which they're still refusing to do. And finally, in Wuhan, where this originated, they put a travel ban. You couldn't go from Wuhan to Beijing. You could go from Wuhan to Rome or London or Vancouver or Seattle or San Francisco or New York or Los Angeles, and hundreds of thousands of people did. carrying this virus around the world. So pinpointing the day using a day reminds me of how dishonest the world organizations were, and China in particular, about it, and including the origin of the virus to this day. I mean, lab leak theory now seems to be a majority of people's opinion, but you were kicked off Twitter if you said that. People lost their jobs for saying that. But what's interesting about this book, Andy, remember the phrase Francis Collins and Tony Fauci and Deborah Birx, even Trump administration officials, follow the science. And that was an arrogant phrase anyway, because science is rarely that clear cut. But what this book, to me, it's really valuable thing. And the new way of thinking is they weren't following the science. They weren't following the most up-to-date idea about how you deal with a pandemic of this sort. It started when George W. Bush was president. He read John Barry's classic book about the 1980 influenza. And he said, are we prepared for this? And the government wasn't. So they began developing the National Health Institutes of Health and other CDC started developing protocols. And this was one idea, social distancing. It was a theory. But by the time this pandemic came, Bush had been out of office for a while. There was newer thinking. There was even older thinking and newer thinking that social distancing probably wasn't the right thing. Masks weren't the right thing. That closing schools should be only as a last resort. And in this case, in the COVID, by October of 2005, they knew that this virus wasn't really hitting school children, and closing the schools was probably doing more harm than good. And they stayed with that policy for 2 more years. And so, if you're going to use phrases like follow the science, which is pretty haughty, you at least ought to follow the science. And it doesn't sound like that's what the government was doing.
The phrase I remember, Tom, I think it was 6 weeks to stop the spread or something like that. Remember, we were going to just shut down for a little while. And I do look back on that period and remember being just not really knowing what it would mean for my business, for my family, for my kids who were in college. We had actually bought at that point a condominium, which we were going to move into. We sold it right before they shut down the entire economy of Maryland, because I just didn't know what the heck was going to happen. I didn't want to be sitting with kids at home and 2 mortgages. And anyway, it was a bizarre time. And now it seems, I do think we've sort of memory holds a lot of it. And it is, I think, worthwhile to sort of spend the time and really sort of dig back in and really rethink about what we did right and wrong as a country.
Absolutely. And honestly, reading this story, and I urge all of our listeners to go to Real Clear Politics and click on the link and read it. My blood started to boil. I get so angry when I read now about, even if and we were all assuming at the time that, the government had the best of intentions, and that this was the best course of action that they could come up with. And so we were all willing to do our part. And I'm sure you guys did. We were wiping down our groceries and, doing all this crazy shit that they were telling us that we were supposed to do, 6 feet, social distance, all that stuff. And what we now know, and what this book is documenting, is that, it wasn't settled science. There were other voices out there. This was not sort of the best in class thinking necessarily. And again, I've said this before, but when you're faced with a crisis like that, what you would want, what you would hope to have are folks who are in positions of power, who you get all the smartest minds in a room, and you sit down, you lock the door for 24 hours or 36 hours or whatever, and say, okay, what do we know? What do we not know? What's the game plan? What makes the most sense? And what we know now is that's not at all what happened. In fact, the folks like Tony Fauci got in a room and locked the door and kept the other people out who had differing opinions, like Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff from Harvard. And these were not cranks. These were world-class, world-renowned epidemiologists. And they simply not even ignored them. They smeared them for their views. And they decided,
and tried to silence them.
People, tried to silence them. They decided that this little cabal, that we had to shut down schools, we had to shut down the government, we had to, that we were going with a mass vaccination That was the only way out of this. This was a Tony Fauci. He talked about this, and it's just, again, I'm getting agitated just talking about it now. I mean, it's just
well, Tom, the science, the theory still is now you try to develop a vaccine as fast as you can. That hasn't changed. It's what you do while you're waiting for that process. And we still don't know if the vaccine, it didn't prevent you from getting infected to the later strains. Did it prevent people from dying? That's the reigning theory, but there's still things we don't know. But Tom, when you're talking about that, it reminds me of something. Tony Fauci and Francis Collins have been subpoenaed, and they've testified. And you remember those hearings, Andy, the Democrats are saying you Saint Tony, and the Republicans are saying you should be in prison for perjury. And what I have not heard them address, either of those two guys, and I know them both, is ask a question, not an unfriendly question, just a factual question. Listen, I assume, doctor, that you were acting in good faith, but why did you feel it was appropriate to censor these other voices, to not get other opinions, to shut down the debate? Why did you think that was appropriate? Because that still, to me, is the most harmful thing in a way that happened. Well, not the most harmful. 1 million Americans died, but this is something we can't have a democratic republic if we can't have a free exchange of ideas in a crisis. I have not heard from either of them an explanation for why they felt it was okay to attack Jay Bhattacharya, for instance, and silence him. I don't know. I don't know.
You said earlier, Carl, that the phrase "follow the science" was haughty. Imagine the arrogance you would have to say, as Tony Fauci did, "I am science."
Yeah. Well,
they're attacking me because I am science.
Yeah, I'm not defending that. What I'm saying is I still don't know why they shut down debate. I just don't know how that was allowed to happen.
Well, guys, we're going to have to take a quick break here. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl, and we'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl. And guys, Canada's ruling Liberal Party chose a new prime minister to replace Justin Trudeau on Sunday. The new man in charge, at least until the next election, is Mark Carney. He's a former central banker. He won with 86% of the vote, and he struck out at Donald Trump immediately, saying in his victory speech, quote, "These are dark days brought on by a country we no longer trust." And he added, "We didn't ask for this fight, but Canadians are always ready when someone else drops the gloves." So, Carl, that's a pretty good hockey reference. The end of the Trudeau era, but it doesn't sound like the new guy is looking to patch things up with the United States. Does it even matter that there's a new leader in Ottawa?
Well, you think about the hockey analogy he used. It's been a long time since the Stanley Cup was won by a Canadian team. So we may play hockey better than they do now, but they still fight. I mean, you don't want those Canadian players still, you can't insult them. This is an interesting development. Donald Trump dislikes Justin Trudeau. Well, now he's going to dislike this guy, and he thinks it will help him stay in power and help his party stay in power to pick fights with Donald Trump, to lash out at Trump. And I've said this before on our show. I was in Ottawa, to Toronto in January, and that 51st state thing really stuck in their craw. They don't get the joke. They don't understand that Trump was mainly trolling Justin Trudeau, and they're on edge. But the real threat to that country is not that silly talk about the 51st state. It's these tariffs, and they're angry about it. And to my way of thinking, they have a right to be angry about it because it's a clear violation of a treaty that Trump himself negotiated.
Well, Tom, the Liberals were sort of down in the polls. The Conservatives were ahead. Now they're sort of inching back. I think they're down by like 10 points, and raises a question of whether or not this is actually helping the Liberals, and they may win the election, which is scheduled for October, but could happen before that, I guess.
There's no question that this has helped the Liberals. I mean, the Liberal Party was in disrepair. I mean, Justin Trudeau had really driven them into the ditch, but Trump has managed to not only resuscitate the Liberal Party, but unite Canada. I mean, even the Conservative, Pierre Poilievre came out and said, this is, we're not going to stand for this. We're going to fight, and I'll fight. And so both sides are saying the same thing now in Canada, which is these tariffs are bullshit, and we're going to fight them, and we're not taking this crap from you Americans. And if you're going to cause us pain, we're going to cause you pain too. And so it's not a great situation in terms of our relations with Canada. And will it lead to a Liberals winning that election? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But there's no question that Justin Trudeau is gone, and he had so much baggage. I mean, he really did. I think a lot of Canadians are sort of happy to see him go. I mean, he really transformed that country, and not necessarily in a good way, in terms of his leadership. And if you remember the trucking protests, the way that he handled that was, I think, a turning point for him politically. Again, not in a good way. And so,
and Dom, don't leave out when the pro-terrorists were marching in Montreal and denouncing Jews. He was at a Taylor Swift concert.
That's true.
Trying to dance.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, he's from a political dynasty there, and it's kind of similar to the Cuomos. We talked about Andrew Cuomo trying to, his father had built such a great name, family name in politics in New York State, and Cuomo rode that to office and then sort of, tarnished it and is now trying to revive it. So maybe there's another act for Justin Trudeau in the future. He's a young guy. He could always make a comeback perhaps, but at least for the moment, he's leaving, and he's leaving the family name, in worse shape than it was in when he took office.
Well, this guy, Mark Carney, I guess he's 59 years old, I believe, but he's kind of a bureaucrat. He's never really run. He's not known for his political skills, and it'll be interesting to see how he does, and whether the fact that he's not Justin Trudeau is enough to sort of keep them on this trajectory. And if they win, that will be something that an unintended consequence of Donald Trump's tariffs.
Talk about getting thrust into a situation where you got to run a campaign, you're running from behind, but he's got, how much political experience does he have?
Yeah, but here's the thing about
none.
That. He's going to have to, at some point, bashing Trump's not going to be enough. He's going to have to speak to the liberal experiment, how Trudeau's party took that country to the left and made it woke, and the immigration, whether their immigration policies are the right policies. He's going to have to, at some point, talk about other things.
Yeah.
Besides Trump and tariffs.
Right. Well, I want to let's talk about something a little closer to home, and that's this announcement by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who says he's eliminated 83% of the programs at the U.S. Agency for International Development. That's the agency that's been targeted by DOJ. And he said on Monday today, he said these programs spent tens of billions of dollars in ways that did not serve, and in some cases even harmed the core national interests of the United States. So, Tom, I think score one for the DOJ team, but and the remaining programs are going to be moved under the State Department. But is this a good thing? And what do you make of DOJ's victory?
Well, my personal opinion is it's probably a good thing to shrink the size of government. But the question is it constitutional? I mean, is the State Department, is the Secretary of State allowed to cancel programs that have been authorized by Congress, to spend money authorized by Congress, or not spend it in this case, right? And that's the question that's being, going to be settled in the courts. And but I think he said they cut 5,200 contracts they canceled, and there's another 1,000 left, 17% or so that, as you mentioned, are going to be now folded in under the State Department. So I think it's probably a good thing. I don't think when Congress authorized USAID that it wasn't supposed to be some sort of separate, as many would call it, and Marco Rubio has called it, sort of a rogue agency that doesn't report to anyone. It sort of took on a life of its own. And so I think to have it, realign with the values of the current administration, or the next administration, it should be aligned with the values of the president who's voted into office and is appointing, Secretary of State. I think that's probably a good thing. But again, the question is, well, is it constitutional?
Well, Carl, it's been a tough week for Elon Musk. His dealerships are being attacked. And
before we go to Elon Musk, though, I want to say something about USAID.
okay,
Tom's point that there's a question whether this is a legal constitutional measure, but the other thing is, I think calling it a rogue agency is wrong. Not every dollar that USAID spent was approved by Congress, Republican Congresses and Democratic Congresses, every single dollar. And AID, there's no secret what they were doing. The congressional committees could have found out. So this was the policy of the United States. And when Secretary of State Rubio says that, some of, this money implies that 83% of it was wasted, I'm skeptical of that. How much of that are they canceling contracts for PEPFAR that saved hundreds of thousands of lives in sub-Saharan Africa by providing HIV drugs and anti-malarial drugs? Or they, how much of this money was going to prevent mass starvation in Somalia and places like that? I'm skeptical that, and okay, now we'll get to Elon, that Elon Musk and his people have.
But
really
hold on.
Have
they canceled 83% of contracts, not 83% of the dollars, Carl.
Yeah,
well,
that's an important distinction.
I understand, but I'm skeptical that they listen. I could be wrong, and I'm not even saying that it's not that I'm wrong. I'm just saying I don't know that they had the time to go through these programs thoroughly enough. That's all. I'm saying that. If you're convinced they did, Tom, fine, but I'm just not sure of that.
Well, I think a lot of the contracts, and we've seen, Trump read a list of them in his speech the other night, and we've seen some of the stuff that USAID was spending money on. And I think, most people think that's not what the United States should be spending money on. PEPFAR, yes, but right? Puppet shows, trans puppet shows in South America, maybe not. And again, that's not like it was $100 billion. It was maybe like 10 million or whatever, but still $10 million to most Americans is still a lot of money.
I think what makes sense to me about it is putting it back under the State Department so that it is tied to the overall agenda of the Secretary of State who works for the president. I think that makes sense. I agree that I'm not sure, I think we could argue till the end of time over which programs were good and bad, but they are going through this kind of with a hatchet, Carl. I get that point, but maybe that's what it takes, I guess. But let's talk about Elon Musk. We just got about a minute left here, and Tom, he just
we only get to spend 1 minute on Elon Musk.
Yeah, sorry.
You can have the whole minute, Tom.
well, he's having a week. His rocket blew up, and then Twitter was attacked. Cyber attack. But honestly, I think, and Tesla stock is down. Yeah. Well, look, I think the most significant thing is that these attacks on Tesla dealers, right? 5 Cybertrucks were Molotov cocktailed the other night, and some charging stations were burned, and all this stuff. The left is resorting to crime and violence, which is an unsettling thing, and I think they should put a stop to that immediately. You can be mad about Elon Musk, and you can protest, and you can stomp your feet, and you can not buy your Tesla, or you can sell it for, leave it by the side of the road if you don't want it anymore, whatever. But you can't be breaking the law and committing violence. That's unacceptable, and that's where I think the left has just completely lost the plot.
So global warming wasn't an existential threat to the planet because they loved Tesla before.
Yeah, there was a moment. That was a moment. But in Salem, Oregon, someone actually shot into a dealership with a high-powered rifle. It is not to make light of any of it. It's getting scary, and you're hoping, or I'm hoping, that it stops, I guess.
And again, I think the media bears some responsibility for whipping up this Elon derangement syndrome. Again, you see these fear-mongering pieces. New York Times front page today, talking about, all these people are, Elon's taking, the richest man in the world is taking money out of the mouths of children overseas, and millions of people are going to die. And if you are a diehard progressive and you believe that stuff, then you probably do look at him and think that, well, we just don't have a difference of political opinion. He's evil and he needs to be stopped. And that leads people to rationalize, we can stop him by using violence. And again, we just have to get away from that. And that we do that by enforcing the law and bring these people to justice.
Yeah. All right. Well, guys, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl, and we'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl. And Carl, the Democrats continue to try to find a path out of the political wilderness. At least some think that road leads to Stephen A. Smith, the ESPN sports commentator. He was on The View, and when asked about how he'd do in a crowded field of presidential wannabes, he said citizens, particularly on the left, are desperate, and I mean it when I say it. I think I can beat them all. We ran a piece about this on the front page of RCP, so I assume that means there's something real going on here. What do you make of the groundswell for Stephen A. Smith for president?
Yeah, the groundswell consists of Stephen A. Smith talking about himself, the Guardian writing a story about it, and Tom Bevan putting the Guardian story on our front page. That's the groundswell. That's the origin of it. Sometimes these questions aren't as difficult as they seem. You think, wouldn't it be nice to have a tall, handsome, charismatic governor of the largest state in the country with presidential ambitions? Wouldn't that be great? Then maybe we could nominate him and he could win. Oh, yeah, they have a person like that, it's Gavin Newsom. Or what about if we had a really charismatic female governor of a Midwestern state that Democrats have to carry? Oh, we have that too. It's Gretchen Whitmer. What about a Jewish guy who's empathetic and well-spoken, and he's the governor of Pennsylvania, the key state, not just the Keystone State. Oh, yeah, Josh Shapiro. So I know it's fashionable to hate on politicians, but we have right now 3 governors, 4 if you add Wes Moore, governor of your state, Andy, who are very charismatic people, very knowledgeable, can make the case. You shouldn't think because Joe Biden was president that we have to go to Stephen A. Smith. Although I like Stephen A. Smith, and I think he's a breath of fresh air. And I think he's said some things that the Democratic Party needs to hear. That doesn't mean he should be president of the United States.
Well, Tom, since you put the piece on the front page of RCP,
you're going to give him a rebuttal?
Well, by the way, it wasn't the only piece. Kurt Bardella wrote something in the LA Times. So there's more than one person out there talking about Stephen A. Smith. He was the topic of discussion on some of the shows over the weekend. So look, it is a little far-fetched, obviously, but and it's not quite the Michael Avenatti who the media wanted to run for president based on nothing other than his just hatred for Donald Trump. Stephen A. Smith is not that. We're in a different category, and he is saying things that Democrats I think would be wise to listen to, or at least not just sort of dismiss out of hand, because Democrats are in a hole. They do have a problem, and so I think they need to be circumspect when they're taking advice from people, and certainly. So he has some things to say. I mean, obviously he's Stephen A. Smith. He has a certain style. That's how he's, got himself a $100 million contract from ESPN by just, sort of being the loudest, brashest, voice in the room. But he has no political experience. And I mean, again, Carl's not a Jacksonian. So Carl would, say he's not even qualified to run. He shouldn't run, whatever. I'm like, look, I think the political process, if he wants to run, go for it. We'll see how he does. I mean, it often looks easy to outsiders. They think they can do it better, and then they get in there and suddenly they realize, whoa, man, it's not. That's what makes Donald Trump so unique. I mean, he actually accomplished that when you've seen, person after person after person, even folks who are well accomplished, Mike Bloomberg, for example, and he spent what $500 million in the primary and got nowhere.
Ross Perot, Lee Iacocca, you'd have these people, and
Ross Perot was pretty successful. He's probably the second number behind Donald Trump, but there are a lot of folks who get, oh, I could do that. It's easy, whatever. And they get in there and they just get their head handed to them. And, but if he wants to do it, that's why they play the game.
I mean, I think one of the questions it raises for me is that his message to the Democrats is sort of, get in line here. And he's praised Donald Trump. he said this about Trump to Bill Maher. He said the man was impeached twice. He was convicted on 34 felony counts, and the American people still said he's closer to normal than what we see on the left. And I'm just wondering, I mean, I agree that that's a message that they should at least fondle and think about. But do you think it would have any success at all when it comes to actually getting the
I don't think
nomination?
we want the Democrats fondling anything.
But anybody with that message.
Well, you start to think about what if he really ran? I assume he's not going to do it, but let's say he did it. He had a PAC and he raised some money, put in some of his own money, and went down to South Carolina in a crowded field and won the primary. Well, then we have to have a different discussion. All right.
Yeah. Well, hey, Tom, let's talk about this Atlantic piece too about memes
please.
for J.D. Vance.
Yes.
What the Atlantic said was people can see in them if you go on X. There's all these pictures of J.D. Vance doing different things, all photoshopped. And what they wrote was the Vance memes might work against the vice president. There is no silver lining to looking like a doofus. The Vance memes seem to contain an admission as well that even some conservatives do not see him as essential to the MAGA movement.
Look, this is a classic sort of textbook example of the elites. This journalist for the Atlantic, right? I'm sure she's well credentialed, not having a freaking clue about what she's talking about or the movement she's talking about or anything. I mean,
it's hard to write about politics if you're humorless, Tom. Right?
These memes started popping up over the weekend, and they just caught fire, and they were hilarious, and everyone was trying to outdo each other, and right, it was just putting J.D. Vance's face on everything, and
they're like Chuck Norris jokes.
It's hilarious, and J.D. Vance even acknowledged it. I mean, he posted a picture of him with his face superimposed over Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the TV screen like, I know, I see what you're doing. So even JD's in on the joke and thinks it's funny and good and not, derogatory or in any way hurting his image. It's good for his image. And it just proves once again that while, 95% of America can get the joke, sometimes even the people who are quote unquote the smartest people just have no freaking clue what's going on.
Well, Carl, we got about a minute left here, but I think the argument is that, as I see it, is that every joke has a kernel of truth. So when they show him as a baby or whatever, they may not even know it, but what they're thinking is that he is sort of a junior member of the team and not important. I mean, do they have their finger on the pulse at all here?
I think they missed the point. I'm with Tom on this. I just think this is supposed to just be funny. And if you think about what it really is, it shows some respect to J.D. Vance, not the other way around. It shows he's in the conversation. He's interesting. They think he can take a punch. I actually think it's just a positive thing.
Yeah. All right, well, guys, we're going to have to leave it there. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl. But don't go away. Tom will be back here with Phil Wegmann, our White House correspondent, right after these words.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. Joined now by Phil Wegmann. He is our White House reporter. Mr. Wegmann, how are you doing?
Doing well. Happy Monday.
Happy Monday. All right, Phil, let's talk about President Trump and where things stand. He gave an interview over the weekend to Maria Bartiromo, Fox Business, and said a couple of interesting things. He said when she asked about the country, the economy possibly going into a recession, that's what the Atlanta Fed is now predicting, a contraction in Q1. Got JP Morgan, some others raising their projections, their odds of the country going into recession. He wasn't the boastful, unequivocal Trump that he normally is. Oh, no. He said, listen, this is, I don't like to predict things like that. And we're in a period of transition. It's all going to work out great. We're going to be rich in the end. But noticeably, he hedged his bets a little there, Phil.
That's right. He said, I hate to predict things like that. And I can tell you, after having covered
He
Donald
predicts
Trump
things like that all the time.
all the time. I mean, after the better part of a decade of covering this man, Donald Trump is not one to hedge his bets. He's not one to duck a question, which is why this was so interesting. And I think it fits into a larger theme here that we see coming out of this White House. Yes, they are obsessed with where the stock market is. Don't forget, this is Donald Trump, who, when the Dow Jones Industrial hit 30,000 during his first term, walked out to the press briefing room to herald this magic number. But I think that the dodge to that question does indicate something, which is they are not so focused on GDP and on where the stock market is on any given particular day, because they know that their tariffs are going to create turbulence, and they value what they see as the policy result of those tariffs more than they do the market doing well on any given day. They really think that they can use these tariffs to stop the flow of fentanyl, to bring manufacturing back to the Midwest, and if it causes Wall Street heartburn, so be it.
Yeah, but I mean, and Maria also mentioned the stock market because, as you mentioned, look, Trump was obsessed with the stock market when he came into office. When it went down under Biden, he was like, he'd rip him for that. And now suddenly he's saying, well, I don't like to pay attention to the stock market all that much. So he's definitely singing a different tune on the economy. And I think that speaks to, Trump has very good political instincts. And I think he knows that's his biggest vulnerability. That's one of the main reasons why he was elected. It is one of the, main promises that he wants to keep. And, it's in his mind, it's gonna take some time, and people are gonna have to suffer a little bit.
Yep, but what's interesting is that Donald Trump doesn't have to run for re-election. He is focused solely and entirely on his legacy right now. And last week, there were a series of pronouncements from the Trump administration, which were very different, not just from where they were during their first term, but from where Republicans have been for the last 40 years. The GOP has always thought that what is good for Wall Street is good for proverbial Main Street. And instead, we heard Donald Trump say, as he paused some of these tariffs on Canada and Mexico, that he wasn't looking at the markets. This was right after his own Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, told investors in New York that cheap goods are not the essence of the American dream. And then later in the day, you had the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, someone who very much watches the markets for a living prior to politics, saying in a statement that their chief focus was not if the markets went up or down half a percentage point on any given day. The problem is that in the last month, the markets have gone down 5%. They know that there is some pain associated with these tariffs, and they know that Wall Street wants certainty at a moment when this White House isn't giving it to them.
You mentioned Trump being focused on his legacy, but isn't part of his legacy, isn't that dependent on whether J.D. Vance runs and wins? I mean, if Trump is seen in the grand scheme of things, he was a two-term president, but it was interrupted. And then after his second term, Republicans were out of power again. I would think that is his fate, and J.D. Vance's fate now is sort of inextricably tied to, what Trump's ultimate legacy is going to be.
And it's going to be awfully hard, not only for a Vice President Vance to run in 2028 if the market is not doing well, it's going to be an indictment on this larger program that Trump has been engaged in, where he's trying to make the Republican Party, less fiscally conservative, less focused on, business. I mean, certainly, yes, that is there. Trump loves deregulation. He loves business. He loves tax cuts. But what we've seen from this Republican Party that has sort of realigned is they aren't just willing to say what is most efficient is best. Their argument is, what is good for business also has to be good for individual voters. And so I think that there's a more immediate mile marker here, which is going to be these midterms. Republicans, they're walking around like, they've won everything, but the election was just one thing. They have a very narrow margin in the House. It looks like they could be on their way to losing it in these midterms. And so this is going to be a question of, all right, you said you could get inflation under control. You said you could bring back good paying jobs. You said that the price of gas would come down. You can't argue with the market. You can argue with different pundits and politicians, but the numbers are what they are. And I think that, voters will make that determination in the grocery checkout line.
Phil, you mentioned Republicans and certainly, Donald Trump's sort of power. Big vote coming up in the House on this continuing resolution that Trump has fully endorsed. I saw Caroline Levitt on Fox News in the morning. Maybe it was this morning. Gosh, I don't even know. Just talking about how the full-throated endorsement from the White House. How important is this vote in terms of showing how much juice Trump has with his Republican caucus, and it also presents big risks for Democrats if they're going to not vote for this and shut the government down. There are a number of Democrats who are in these Trump districts that could be a really, really tough vote for them.
Yeah, and certainly what we've seen from this White House is that they have leaned on every lever of executive authority that they have. The first 6 weeks of the Trump show has been executive authority 100% of the time. Now he's got to go to Congress, and now he has to lean on members to give him what he wants, which is this clean continuing resolution. If they're unable to do this, one, it's an indictment on Trump's ability over the caucus, and certainly the conference, excuse me, and certainly he was able to rescue Speaker Mike Johnson at the beginning of the year when it seemed that Republican holdouts were going to keep him from picking up the gavel a second time. But if he's unable to get this clean continuing resolution, there's a possibility of a government shutdown. But more than that, it makes it difficult for Trump to do these things that are going to be more permanent for his legacy. He wants that border wall. He wants these tax cuts to become, codified and permanent. If he can't keep the government open, well, that's kind of a dress rehearsal for those bigger things.
Yeah. We got just a couple minutes left, Phil. And so let's talk about the one area where I think that Trump has delivered, and he's delivered sort of probably beyond expectations in terms of the border and the numbers at the border. There was a report, CBS this morning had a reporter, and they sent a reporter to the border, and he'd been to the border before under the Biden administration. He said when he got down there this time, he didn't see a single person. They were there for 4 hours. They didn't see a single person. You've seen the numbers. They're at historic lows. And there was news also that the Trump administration, Kristi Noem at DHS has converted the what was it called, the CPB, like the app that people were using to get into the country. They've converted that now to a self-deportation app, and you can just click on there and basically say you're leaving the country. So immigration is probably the one area where I think Trump has, much to the chagrin, I'm sure, of the Democrats who still believe or want open borders, but certainly for the vast majority of folks, this is something they voted on and something that Trump has delivered on.
I'm really curious if there is an illegal immigrant who is going to go to that app and update their phone beforehand, of course, so that they can download it and just click, self-deport. I'm not certain that there are going to be many takers, but I was struck during the joint address to Congress when the president made that argument. He said, the media told all of you, and so did Democrats, that we needed a change to the laws. It turns out we just need a change in president. And the numbers don't lie in terms of the number of, interactions between Border Patrol and border crossers. They're way down. They've plummeted. And if you're someone like James Lankford, the Oklahoma Senate Republican who quarterbacked that bipartisan border deal during the last months of Biden, only for it to fall apart at the last minute, you've got to wonder, was that a lot of wasted effort? The question in Trump's mind now is he's gotten the border crossings down. Is he going to be able to achieve the deportation efforts that he's talked about? He wants the largest in American history. What we just heard from Tom Homan, though, is that Border Patrol, they're at their limit at this point in terms of the number of beds that they have that they can then, process some of these migrants. And that was an argument to Congress. Give me more resources so that I can carry out the president's agenda.
Yeah. All right. We will leave it there. Phil Wegmann, White House reporter for Real Clear Politics. Phil, good to have you as always.
Thank you, sir.
All right. And that's going to do it for us. On behalf of Andy and Carl, I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. We'll see you back here tomorrow night. Good night.